All right, good evening. Welcome back to World War America podcast. This is Anderson Thomas. Thanks again for joining me. So, three tips for tracking down Chinese government police service stations in your neighborhood. Yeah, 3 tips for tracking them down. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that you might have a Chinese government police service station in your neighborhood outside of China. That's right. So, in case you didn't know, the Chinese government has set up police service stations all around the world as part of their Fox Hunt and Skynet operations. Operations that entail sending Chinese nationals back to China from countries all over the world. It's claimed these Chinese nationals are persuaded to return to China where they face criminal prosecution. These persuasion techniques can be harsh. So these police service stations set up all over the world to help persuade certain people to return to China, they're kind of not too nice. And the methods used, once again, to persuade tend to be pretty harsh. So, how do you track down one of these service stations in your neighborhood? Here are my 3 tips. Tip number 1, read an article in the National Post, the Canadian National Post, titled, "Why Beijing is Allegedly Opening Police Stations on Canadian Soil." In that piece, a report titled 110 Overseas Chinese Transnational Policing Gone Wild. Once again, there's a report in there titled 110 Overseas Chinese Transnational Policing Gone Wild. This report was done by a group called Safeguard Defenders. When you're in that report, go to page 13 and look at the Americas, and you'll notice there are some service stations here in America. Now, when attempting to trace Chinese operative movements in your own neighborhood, rely heavily on property records. I'm going to say it again. When attempting to trace Chinese operative movements in your neighborhood, rely heavily on property records. Always remember who you're researching, okay? Remember who you're researching. Property is always the place to look when dealing with a transnational Chinese operation. I'm telling you right now, okay? Also, this is my 3rd tip. So that was tip number 2. When attempting to trace Chinese operative movements in your neighborhood, rely heavily on property records, okay? Tip number 3. Check for nonprofits with the word Fuqing in the name. Fuqing, F as in Frank, U, Q, I, N as in Nancy, G. Fuqing. Check for nonprofits with the word Fuqing in the name. Okay? So here are my 3 tips. First, read that article in the National Post titled "Why Beijing is Allegedly Opening Police Stations on Canadian Soil." Tip number 2, when attempting to trace Chinese operative movements in your neighborhood, rely heavily on property records. Okay? Tip number 3, check for nonprofits with the word Fuqing in the name. Good luck. Good hunting. We'll talk tomorrow and I'll give you an update on this. Take care.